How many of you have stood on that bridge, looked over into those waters of the creek, and thought to yourself, my God, this is a beautiful place? Have you done it? Raise your hand. I figured most of you haven't. If you haven't yet, then walk up there when we're done and do that. That's Catoctin Creek. You're standing in the middle of one of Virginia's most fertile valleys, the Catoctin Valley. That creek is a Virginia scenic river, and this road is something that we should celebrate, along with the bridge that helps us to cross that creek. Some of the first people who saw that creek left their imprint on it. If you're an archaeologist, it's kind of heaven from here all the way to the Potomac River several miles away. These were Native Americans who, they would come in the spring and in the fall, Native Americans coming up from the coast, Algonquians, Iroquois making a transit between North Carolina, where they spent the winter, and New York, upstate, where they spent the summer, and even Siouan coming from the Ohio Valley. They would all meet here, and one of the best places to camp was along this creek. Good fishing, easy to access water, etc. And they left their imprint. When English settlers and German settlers moved in here in the 1730s, they knew what they were looking for. They knew the kind of trees that grew, they knew the kind of soil, they knew the kind of undulating pasture land that they were looking for, and of course this area around here, this whole Catoctin Valley from Waterford all the way to the river, became very useful, either for raising grain or for grazing land in the parts that weren't so good for grain. And it's interesting to think that those people somehow managed to get along. We're darn close to the borderland between the Engländer, those are Quakers, and the Deutsch, who are Germans, who are in that whole northern piece. And yet, cheek by jowl, they got along. And what they left us, of course, was a beautiful little historical valley full of what you would expect. Prosperous houses, Quakers, houses that you would barely notice at all, but underneath are log, Germans. And then, of course, you also would see how they had improved the land. Today, as you come down this road, not much of what was in terms of man-made structures is left. There was a mill here on the left where this big side of this is. Thank you, David. That was Roach's Mill. Just beyond, there was a mill at Millville, which is about a mile to our west. If you think about it, this valley also had two mills at or near Taylorstown, more mills at Waterford. This was mill country. This was a land that made its money on grain, and yet the economy changed over time. And today those mills, except for the one at Waterford, and the one right in the middle of Taylorstown that David Nelson is the steward of, those are gone. There once, at the end of this road, a little intersection called Loyalty, was a freedman's home. My favorite picture of a freedman ever, the so-called downcast look that you often see freed African Americans have after the war when a white person comes along and wants to take their picture. That house is gone. The one-room schoolhouse is gone. The house that Fleming G. Anderson, his father and mother, lived in, which was just a little bit down the road towards Waterford, is still there. It made the official records of the Civil War because Confederates, John Mosby's men, Lige White's men, were on patrol Christmas Eve, 1864, and it seems that Fleming Anderson of the Unionist Independent Loudon Rangers and some of his buddies had come home to his mother's home there along Loyalty Road. He had the idea that he wanted to propose to his favorite best girl. He did. She said yes, and a few minutes later the Confederates showed up, and by the end of a short firefight he was gunned down in his mother's arms with her screaming before him. The house is still there. It's the kind of faded echoes of history that we see on a beautiful road like this. Let's change the subject just a little bit. Think of the first time you went down this road. I probably went down this road at high speed, as I tended to do everything. When I first came to Loudoun County, I suddenly realized that I had one gigantic historic district that nobody much beyond here never heard of. And I decided, since I had a brand new, spanking, lime green Ford Pinto, this is 1973, hadn't exploded yet, that I would come down roads like this and just see what they were like. And I remember the first time I saw this. You too, if you haven't been here before, notice that gigantic Quaker house, which was Bert and Sally Firestone's. That's where they tried to have a foaling operation go on after their horse Genuine Risk won the 1980 Kentucky Derby. The pastures that you see around here, they thought were perfect for it. That didn't work out particularly well. Genuine Risk lived at a ripe old age down at a farm just outside of Bloomfield, between Bloomfield and Upperville. But if we think about the time that you really notice this, it's when you walked it or biked it. Some of you, I noticed, did come here by bike and started to notice not just this beautiful landscape, but also the buildings. And as you go up the hill here across the bridge, there are just some amazing buildings that if you don't have a camera with you, you kick yourself and wish you did. It's that kind of a thing. I remember thinking, wow, would this be great to get my students to learn to interpret history on? Had a history club at Loudon Valley High School 20 years ago, and we decided one Wednesday before Thanksgiving to dump all the students at Loyalty and Featherbed, and we would have an interpreted hike with the students doing the interpretation. Was there enough to interpret? You betcha. Story after story from this road. It's that kind of a place. I think, though, the most important thing about this for us today is it's sort of a quiet, subtle monument to historic preservation. Some of you well remember that there was a moment in early 1974 when Fairfax Water Authority, working with the Army Corps of Engineers, scouting for additional water for when there were droughts in the greater Washington area and water would be short, that they espied the Catoctin Valley from just north of Waterford all the way through Taylorstown to the Potomac River and thought that it would be a grand reservoir. Had they done that, some of you would either have been drowned or, like me, would be getting up in the morning and putting your kayak into the 5-mile-long reservoir. I still wish I had lakefront property. On the other hand, I wouldn't have been able to afford it if it was. We decided that this would be a disaster, and the reason we did is we were so used to this place it never really occurred to us how historical it was and how many historic structures there were. One of the people who noticed that lived right in the village of Taylorstown. It was Phil Aaronkrantz, and he's going to begin to lead a movement, the Catoctin Valley Defense League, and this group of people, association it was, alliance, that was the word, I'm trying to think of what the A stood for, but that organization quickly came up with a plan, and that was, let's make this a scenic river, a Virginia scenic river. Let's make the most likely to be drowned, Taylorstown, let's make that and its environs into a place on the National Register and a Loudoun County Historic District. Let's also make sure that nobody can ever hosey property in somebody else's county such that Fairfax, Arlington suddenly want to put a reservoir in Loudoun. Let's just say no to that. Let's make it state law. Let's let the General Assembly do it. And of course, let's get some propaganda out there. We don't call it that. We call it, and I know this because I'm the former educator for the Virginia Piedmont Heritage Area, we call that education, preservation education. But let's do that. And so, of course, we began to do it. The fellow who becomes the pin that holds all this together is a quiet, short, unassuming, chain-smoking fellow by the name of John G. Lewis. How many of you ever met John? If you did, you won't forget him. He was one of the first people I met as a new history educator in Loudoun County back in the 70s. He would come into my history classes and just absolutely enrapture students with his stories, tales, pictures of architecture, and eventually, for those who wanted to come, he opened up his house to us for an afternoon field trip. He was that kind of guy. This is the guy that begins to do the research to make the case for why we need to save this area. Let's go investigate the houses between Waterford and the mouth of Catoctin Creek, particularly around Taylorstown. And so I was rummaging through my stuff today and found what I thought I remembered I had. some of you have seen these. Virginia Historic, can you hold that for just a second? Virginia Historic Landmarks Commission survey form. He was one of those field agents who went out and surveyed houses. He would photograph them, measure them, find out the age of things, and make sure that therefore there was a register of these. These are all, of course, kept in Richmond, but also they're kept at Thomas Balch Library. That's where I found mine when I bought my house. And there's John Lewis on the back of that form. He's the one who did it. How many of you have one of these somewhere in your stuff because your house was surveyed by John Lewis? Any of you have that? I bet a few of you do. Yes, indeed. That's the kind of thing he did. One of the structures that he saw and made sure we know was important was that crumbling old rusting iron bridge that went over what had one time been one of Loudoun's bumpiest roads, but eventually had an all-weather surface as you see it, so it was a little bit better. Our bridge here is actually a result of the Johnstown flood. Remember that flood? It wasn't just in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, killing 2,200 people. It was everywhere along all the major rivers in the mid-Atlantic, including Goose Creek, the Potomac, and the like. Harper's Ferry had a huge flood, and the bridge that took the turnpike from Leesburg to Alexandria was washed out. Today's Route 7. This was the new bridge that was supposed to be much stronger. Apparently it was. We've still got it, and this will be used. In the history of transportation, one thing we see is that we have certain governors who are determined that Virginia is going to join the 20th century. One of those, Harry Byrd. Route 7 for a long time bore his name. Governor Harry Byrd was one who wanted to see Route 7 paved from Winchester, where he owned the Winchester Star, all the way to his office, he hoped, in Washington. He ran for Senate in 1932 and won. And so we managed to get old, bumpy, half-paved Route 54 converted into a new asphalt, beautifully lined Route 7 in 1932-33. That meant better bridges. And this bridge was just not up to the standard that the state was going for. And so this was very carefully pulled down over Goose Creek, east of Leesburg, and set aside. The next year, the Commonwealth decided on a new project. We were going to have the state take over all the county roads. And so the state offered this. 4 counties said no, of which only 2 said no after a year. Loudoun did not say no. We were happy to take Featherbed, one of the bumpiest roads in Loudoun County, and all the other secondary roads, and allow the state to come up with these funky new names. 703, or, you know, what's the number of this one? 673, which of course goes all the way up into Lovettsville, which tells you something, that that's the old road. But at any rate, this was going to become a state-maintained secondary road. And they looked at the bridge sitting around and looked at what we had, which essentially there was no foundations, but it was a board bridge. One young teacher wrote that when she taught at the one-room schoolhouse, having to come from Lovettsville to do that, she would get here and decide on whether she would go over that bridge over Catoctin Creek, and mostly decided she'd rather get soaking wet and wade the creek rather than go over that bridge. That's what this will replace, and so we have it. And over the years, people became rather fond of it. Now, we're talking an 1889 structure built in Ohio by Variety Ironworks. And I think many of you know the more recent story. In 2014, Loudoun is growing massively. We now have huge fire trucks. I used to be a fireman in Percival. The size of fire trucks today is monstrous. And so you will see that what we will do is suddenly say, well, we can't handle a fire truck on an old bridge like that. Besides, it's cracked. Many of you here were involved in negotiations with the Virginia Department of Transportation to try to save this bridge. And some of you went to those hearings, and some of you watched us go from 6 options down to option 2A. Not build a new bridge beside the old bridge, which the old bridge would only be for walking, but rather pull the bridge out, build an under support system and then put the old bridge on top of it. And that's what we have today. For all the world, if you walk over that bridge today and you don't know, it looks like the bridge with the cracks in it, except they aren't. It's special steel underpinning, and it should last us a long, long time. Some of you know why we would want to save this road, this valley, this bridge, monuments to preservation, and some of you also know why we would want to name them for one of the people that was most important in saving that, John G. Lewis. And so today, now we've had this new bridge for 2 years, we dedicate a Department of Historic Resources sign to John. A good name for a good monument to preservation.